The newest release of the Epstein Files has everyone talking. People are discussing the new names that have come out. They're also talking about old names that now have more details attached to them. And of course, many are wondering what this means for Donald Trump and the future of the current administration. But what really stands out to me is not what people are talking about. It's what they are not asking. This latest release feels very different from the ones before. And I believe there is a familiar strategy being used by the government that most people are not noticing. Before we get into that, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss any future updates. It really helps support the channel and keeps you informed as new information comes out. Now, that's what I want to focus on today. I want to explain the method I think is being used in this release of the Epstein Files, something many people may not even realize is happening. I also want to share what I'm noticing in the information, the questions it raises for me, and where I think this discussion might be heading. So let's get into it. The first and most important thing to understand about the most recent release of Epstein Files is it's the largest drop in the entire history of the case, with more than 3.5 million files being dropped in a single day. In my experience with CIA, this is a tactic, a tool that the federal government uses anytime it wants to distract the public for an extended period of time, whether that's the domestic public or a foreign target public. Flooding is all about providing an overabundance of information. Information that isn't always relevant, certainly isn't helpful, and most importantly, isn't manageable. And when you have 3.5 million documents that are released on a single day, it gives the government space. It gives the government space because the public is going to be distracted, focused on 12 million files worth of data, thinking that somewhere in there is some golden nugget, something that's hidden, some mistake, some thread of truth. When you compare that to the first drop of Epstein Files, which was only about 900 files, you can really start to see the difference in scale. Those first 900 files had the world talking about Epstein for months. So, guess what's going to happen when you have 3.5 million files released? You already can see it all across the headlines. Every major newspaper in the world is covering the most recent release of the Epstein Files. And not surprisingly, they're all covering essentially the exact same data points. The names that have been listed, the new names that have been listed, the accusations that are included. They're showing pictures that have been shared that were never shared before, but still don't show anything new at all. And that is exactly why flooding exists. Flooding is a tactic that falls under the category of misdirection and is very similar to something called malinformation or malicious information. Malinformation is factual information that is intended to distract or throw off an actual real investigation, which is very similar to the purpose of misdirection. You don't want people to focus on this. You want them to focus on that. And that is exactly what I'm seeing in this most recent release of Epstein Files. People are talking about what there is, and people are talking about what there was, but people are not talking about what still hasn't been released. One of the biggest questions that people aren't asking is the question about Bill and Hillary Clinton and why it is that they have been held in contempt of Congress. This may be coming as new information to you, and that's not something you should feel bad about. This is a perfect example of flooding in action. Back in October of 2025, a Republican member of Congress asked that Bill Clinton submit to a deposition about the investigation into Epstein. Now, because this topic is so fraught with partisan infighting, the Clintons and many of their Democratic peers, of course, offered to delay and defer their testimony until a different date. Now, as October turned into December, Congress came forward again with a second request, not only for Bill Clinton's deposition, but also for Hillary Clinton's deposition, claiming that the deposition of these two standing government figures would be critical to the investigation of the Epstein case. By the time January 2026 came around, both Clintons had successfully avoided any kind of testimony to Congress and instead submitted a letter saying, I quote, "Every person has to decide when they have seen or had enough and are ready to fight for this country, its principles, and its people, no matter the consequences. For us, now is that time." In essence, Hillary and Bill Clinton, two very high-ranking, experienced, and well-known public figures, are saying that they will not provide testimony to Congress. Not testimony that they believe could be used against them politically, but also not testimony that could advance the investigation of the Epstein case. And because of that, Congress has voted unanimously and in a bipartisan vote to hold the Clintons in contempt of Congress for their unwillingness to contribute to this ongoing investigation. In a formal letter from Congress, the Clintons have been notified of the following. Republicans and Democrats on the House Oversight Committee acted today to hold former President Bill Clinton and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in contempt of Congress for willfully denying lawful and bipartisan subpoenas. By voting to hold the Clintons in contempt, the committee sends a clear message. No one is above the law, and justice must be applied equally regardless of position, pedigree, or prestige. This is a big deal. A former president, a former presidential candidate, who is also the Secretary of State, have officially rejected subpoenas by Congress and the U.S. federal government to participate in a criminal investigation that is not focused on them, but that they believe might somehow impact their own political futures negatively. That is an important point. That is headline news, but that is being overlooked because people are focused on 3.5 million flooded documents that are saying more and more of the same old story. A second important point that's being overlooked because of the flooding that's happening right now is tied to the release of multiple victims who never agreed to having their names released as part of this investigation. Hundreds of women's identities, many of which who were minors at the time, are folded into this Epstein investigation. And the majority of those women never gave permission for their names to be stated or shared publicly. This has journalists and attorneys outraged because not only is it a violation of attorney-client privileges in some cases, but it also shows the lack of attention to detail that the Department of Justice was using as they prepared these documents for public release. And it's that lack of attention to detail that I want to share with you right now, because that is an important point that is being overlooked because so much attention is being paid on the release of victim names. Now, I've already mentioned that in January 2024 was the first time that a tranche of about 900 documents from the Epstein Files were released to the public. And then it was in June of 2024, a little bit more than a year later, that Donald Trump made it clear to the public that he intended to release everything from the Epstein Files. In May of 2025, Attorney General Pam Bondi advised Donald Trump that his name appeared in those Epstein Files. And as a result, in July of 2025, a formal statement came from the Department of Justice saying that no additional Epstein Files would be released. In November of 2025, Congress acted on their own to release 23,000 files from the Epstein case that they had approval to release, which prompted Donald Trump to then release new legislation in November of 2025 called the Epstein Files Transparency Act. With bipartisan support for this act, hundreds of thousands of new Epstein files were released to the public, heavily redacted, almost to the point where they're not really useful to the public reader. A few weeks later, before the end of September 2025, another 30,000 files released, bringing the total release of all Epstein files over the course of 5 years to just under 300,000 files. So, I know the question that you're getting ready to ask is that if it took the government 5 years to approve 300,000 files for release, how could they have possibly approved 312 million files for release in just 30 days? And that's the right question. The fact that the federal government released 3.5 million files related to the Epstein case in early February 2026 isn't a sign of transparency. It's a sign of distraction. And it makes me question the competence of the review that went into those files before they were released. I would argue that the Department of Justice has actually been carrying out that redaction campaign for the last 5+ years. They have been carefully going through all of those records, and they have been choosing what to redact and what not to redact as it relates to powerful political figures. Because at the end of the day, the thing that the government is most concerned with is national security, more so than criminal investigations. So, as DOJ has been going through that process, they've been very focused on protecting information that could have national security impact. Things that talk about presidents, former presidents, foreign. leaders, foreign governments, the kind of conspiracy that could lead to international conflict. And they have not been focused on the details related to a criminal investigation. That's why these files are being released with the names of victims unredacted. Because when they went through and prepared the documents in the first place, they were never worried about the criminal investigation. And they were never worried about the victims. They were never worried about the tech bros and the billionaires and the fantastical names that everybody else is focused on. They were worried about anything that could undermine the sovereignty and the protectability of the United States and the United States administration. So whenever you see headlines that are focused on big names like Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Prince Andrew, you're literally seeing the government win because journalists are acting in a predictable way based on the flooding tactic that the federal government is using. They're picking up the wrong story. The government has known for a long time that these documents are ready for public release because these documents don't have any kind of incriminating evidence that would lead to a national security failure. So, as people write stories about this and repeat that story over and over again, filling the airwaves with empty news, the government is winning. This is the purpose of misdirection, of malinformation, of the flooding tactic. It's worked for generations. It will continue to work for generations to come, and you're seeing it play out in your own news feed every day. My third point about the benefit of flooding is something else that you're seeing play out every day. Journalists and investigative researchers and armchair analysts are so excited to be using new names, to be talking about new files, to be paging through new pictures that they're missing the fact that almost 2.5 million files still reside under the control of the federal government and have not been released to the public. Along with that number, 2.5 million files, is a statement from the Federal Department of Justice saying that there will be no future releases of information. So, what that means is that there are 2.5 million files still left behind that will not be released to the public. In protecting these last 2 million files, the Department of Justice has made very clear exemptions to what cannot be released. And here's a list of those exemptions. Explicit depictions of child sexual abuse, death, or injury, and topics that would jeopardize national security. So, of the 2.5 million files that are still under the control of the federal government, they're saying to you, the American people, that they will never be released because they contain the pictures of sexual abuse, death, or injury of children, or they're actively being used in an ongoing investigation suggesting a criminal investigation, or they would jeopardize national security. This is an important point that the headlines are completely missing because the federal government is admitting to holding on to a giant stack of files that subdivide into 3 important seeming categories, but they're not telling you how many files fit into each category. Are the majority of those 2.5 million files related to images of sexual abuse of children? Because if so, I don't want to see that. Or are the majority of those files being tied to some sort of ongoing investigation? Because that is something that's important to me as an American citizen. I want to know whether 1.5 million of those files are being used to actively inform investigations into our current leadership, into our current Congress, into current tech millionaires or billionaires. And I want to know how many of those files are being tied to some sort of national security risk. Even if you don't tell me what countries and what leaders are involved, you can at least tell me that the majority of these remaining 2.5 million files are actively being used to enhance national security. Maybe that means they're here to protect a current president. Maybe it means they're there to protect a previous president, which would help explain why it is that the Clintons are so unwilling to cooperate in the investigation. If there's anything we've learned from this ongoing dialogue about the Epstein Files, it's that there's a very distinct difference between the rich and powerful and the everyday person. And that makes total sense because the rich and powerful have access to people and networks, technology, and opportunities that the everyday person simply doesn't have. And that's the real issue here. Because when there's a clear gap between the powerful and everyone else, accountability starts to look different. Justice starts to look different. The rules start to look different. I'll leave you with that. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And I will see you in the next video.